At a family dinner, I saw my wife slip powder into my drink, while my mother-in-law watched with a smug smile. So I stood up, acting normal, and quietly switched my glass with hers. But before I begin, please like and subscribe to the channel. And we'd love to hear which part of the world are you joining us from. Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Cedar Hollow was the kind of town that kept its secrets behind clean front porches and freshly mowed lawns. Nestled in the rolling hills outside Knoxville, it sat close enough to Fort Loudon Lake that the smell of pine and water drifted through the streets on summer mornings. People here knew each other's names, attended the same church fundraisers, and waved from their driveways. And like most small towns that prided themselves on knowing everyone, Cedar Hollow was also very good at pretending that nothing was wrong. Brett Halstead had lived in Cedar Hollow for 15 years. He chose it for the same reason he chose everything else in his life, because he worked for it and earned a right to stay. He had not grown up in a place like this. He grew up in a rented house with thin walls and a father who spent his Fridays at the bar and his Saturdays sleeping it off. Money was something other families had. Stability was something Brett decided to build on his own, with his own two hands, starting from the bottom and refusing to look up until the foundation was solid. He started his construction company at 26 with one aging pickup truck and two power tools he borrowed from a neighbor who owed him a favor. The first year was rough. He ate cheap, drove long hours, and took every job he could get, replacing rotted decks, hanging drywall, pouring concrete patios in the July heat. He kept every dollar he made and reinvested most of it. No shortcuts, no loans he cannot cover. He built carefully the same way he would later build lake homes around Fort Loudon, from the foundation up, making sure every joint was tight before adding weight above it. By the time he was 41, Halstead Construction had a reputation that reached beyond Cedar Hollow. People in the county knew his name when they wanted something built right. He had a crew of 8, a full equipment yard, 3 properties he owned outright, and no debt to anyone. The business was not flashy. It was not the kind of success that got written up in the Knoxville newspaper. But it was real, and it was his. Candace came into his life during a renovation project on the north end of town. She was visiting a friend whose kitchen Brett was remodeling, and she stood in the doorway wearing a yellow dress, watching him work with an expression that told him she was interested. She was charming from the first conversation. Warm, funny, quick with compliments. She made Brett feel seen in a way that was unfamiliar to him. He was a man who spent most of his life working, not socializing. He did not have a wide network of close friends. He trusted actions over words and rarely let people in easily. But Candace was patient, and she was good at reading people. They married 2 years later. The wedding was held at the edge of the lake on a Saturday in October, with the trees burning orange and red around them. Brett wore a charcoal suit that did not quite fit the way Candace wanted it to, and she told him so gently and had it altered the week before. He did not mind. He was happy. He believed he had found someone who understood what he was building and wanted to be part of it. What Brett did not understand then was the difference between wanting to be part of something and wanting to own it. Candace loved the boats. She loved the country club dinners where the tablecloths were pressed white and the wine list was longer than the menu. She loved the new SUV Brett bought her every few years without being asked, and she loved the way her friends looked at their lake house when they came over for summer cookouts. She was a natural at performing comfort. She could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 3 new friends and a dinner invitation. People liked her immediately. Brett liked that about her, or at least he told himself he did, because the alternative, that her warmth was mostly performance, was something he was not yet ready to believe. Her mother, Dolores Wexler, made the situation clearer. Dolores was 62, sharp-boned, and precise in everything she said and did. She had worked as an accountant for over 30 years, and she carried herself with the particular confidence of a person who had spent decades believing that money was the only honest measure of a person's worth. She was not rude to Brett in the ordinary sense. She did not shout or insult him directly. She was far too calculated for that. Instead, she managed him with a calm, steady kind of contempt that was somehow worse than outright hostility. The first Thanksgiving after the wedding, The family gathered at Brett and Candace's house. Brett had just finished building a covered porch addition that summer. Built it himself on weekends, designed it to face the lake so the morning light would come in just right. He was proud of it. Dolores walked through the house during the pre-dinner tour, and when they reached the porch, she looked at the view for a moment and said nothing. Then, at the dinner table, she set down her fork, looked at Brett, and said without any particular urgency, "You work hard. I will give you that. But hard work is not the same as success." The table went quiet. Brett looked at her steadily. He did not feel the anger rise the way it might have when he was younger. He had been in enough difficult rooms, negotiating contracts with developers who thought they could squeeze him, managing workers who pushed back when pushed, to know that the people who said things like that were never really talking about success. They were talking about power. "I own 3 houses and a business with no debt," Brett said. Calm. Level. Dolores smiled, thin and slow. "You still think small." The conversation moved on. Candace said nothing. She reached for her wine glass and looked out the window. She did not defend him. She did not offer a redirect or a quiet squeeze of his hand under the table. She simply waited for the moment to pass, and when it did, she laughed at something her mother said, and the dinner continued as if nothing had happened. Brett remembered that moment long after the meal was over. Not because it hurt him. He had been dismissed by sharper people than Dolores Wexler. He remembered it because of Candace's silence, because of the way she chose not to choose. That silence, he would come to understand, was not neutrality. It was a declaration, and it was the first real warning he ignored. The first 3 years were good enough that he talked himself out of the doubts when they appeared. There were real moments. A road trip they took to the Smoky Mountains in their first fall together, where Candace laughed without an audience and made sandwiches at a roadside picnic table and seemed genuinely content with just the trees and the cold air and the two of them. A winter evening when an ice storm knocked out the power, and they sat beside the fireplace with bourbon and a deck of cards and talked until 2 in the morning about things that had nothing to do with the country club or what other people thought. Brett kept those moments the way you keep old photographs, with care and with a growing awareness that you were returning to them less and less. He noticed a drift around the 4th year. It did not arrive as an event. It arrived the way a house settles off-level, slowly, invisibly, until the doors no longer close quite right. Candace began comparing. Not openly, not in ways Brett could address directly, but she would mention what a friend's husband had bought his wife for their anniversary, or note that the Hendersons down the road had just put in a pool, or point to something in a magazine with a look that was not quite a request, but was never quite nothing either. Brett spent money deliberately. He invested, saved, and bought things only when the value was real. Candace's relationship with money was different. She spent the way some people exhale without thinking about how much was left. He did not argue about it. He adjusted the accounts, restructured what he could, and said nothing. He was not a man who spent his energy on arguments that produced no useful outcome. He was a man who quietly secured what he had built and waited to understand the full shape of the problem before he responded to it. The changes started small, the way most things that matter do. About 2 years before the dinner, Brett began noticing shifts in Candace's behavior that he could not immediately name. She kept her phone face down on tables when she used to leave its screen up. She laughed too quickly at the wrong moments and went quiet in others. She started going to bed later than usual, and when Brett woke at 2 in the morning for water, he would find the living room lit by the blue glow of her phone screen. When he appeared in the doorway, she put the phone down without unlocking it and said she was just scrolling. He believed her the first time. Then came the Nashville weekends. She started calling them shopping trips. 2 nights here, 3 nights there, always with a friend whose name Brett recognized, but whose face he had never seen. At first the trips were once a month, then twice. The credit card statements showed hotel stays in the Midtown area, boutique places, not cheap, and dinners at restaurants he knew by reputation as the kind where you made reservations weeks ahead. He asked her once what she bought. She carried in 2 shopping bags the next morning and pulled out a scarf and a pair of shoes. He nodded. He let it go, but something in him had shifted. The part of Brett that built things from the ground up was also the part of him that could read a structure for weakness. He had spent 15 years looking at houses that looked fine from the outside while the framing rotted quietly inside. He knew what hidden damage looked like. It looked normal on the surface. It looked like exactly what it said it was, until you pressed on it. One Tuesday afternoon in late April, Candace told him she was driving into Knoxville for a spa day. She had made an appointment, she said. Something about a deep tissue massage and a facial. She kissed him on the cheek at the door and left before noon. Brett finished a call with a subcontractor, pulled on his jacket, and got in his truck. He told himself he was not following her. He told himself he was just driving the same road. He was lying to himself, and he knew it, and he kept driving anyway. He spotted her SUV parked in the lot of a hotel off the interstate, a mid-range place with a restaurant attached, and a covered entrance where valets in blue vests moved back and forth between cars. Brett pulled to the far side of the lot and cut his engine. He sat with his hands on the wheel and waited. 12 minutes passed. Then the entrance doors opened and Candace came out. She was wearing sunglasses and a jacket he had not seen before, and she was smiling the way she smiled when she was being charming for someone specific, head slightly tilted, eyes bright. A man came out behind her, tall, mid-30s, wearing a leather jacket that cost more than most people pay for their car insurance. He had the easy confidence of a person who had practiced being looked at and decided he liked it. He caught up to Candace and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him. The hug that followed was not a greeting. It was something older and more settled than that. Brett watched for a moment. Then he started the truck and drove home. He did not feel the way he expected to feel. There was no surge of heat, no impulse to get out of the truck or make a call. There was instead a cold, clean stillness that settled into his chest and stayed there. He had seen enough in his life to know that the moment right after a hard truth was not the moment to act. You did not pour a new foundation in bad weather. You waited, you prepared, and then you built something that would not fall. He later learned the man's name was Trenton Vale. He was a car salesman from Nashville, successful enough, flashy enough, with a gift for making people feel like they were in on something special. He sold luxury vehicles to people who wanted to believe their purchases said something about who they were. Brett could have guessed the type. When Candace came home that evening, she smelled of a different soap than the one she used at home. She set 2 small shopping bags on the kitchen island and described the spa in specific detail, the lighting, the music, the kind of oil they used. It was a good performance. The details were real enough that she had clearly planned them. Brett listened and nodded and asked no questions. He made dinner. They ate. He watched her across the table, and he thought about foundations, and he waited. A month after the afternoon in the parking lot, Candace brought papers to the kitchen table on a Saturday morning. She set them down next to Brett's coffee with the careful, casual gesture of someone who had practiced how to make the moment feel natural. She sat across from him and folded her hands. She was wearing a soft expression that Brett had learned to read as her persuasion face. Not fake, exactly, but assembled, put together for a purpose. "My friend Karen's husband passed away last month," she said. "Heart attack. He was 44. She paused. "Karen is completely fine financially. They had a life insurance policy. She told me it was the only thing that made everything bearable." Brett picked up the papers. He read slowly. It was a life insurance policy application. The coverage amount on the first page stopped him for a second. $5 million. He turned the page and found the premium schedule, the payout structure, the beneficiary designation. Candace's name. He flipped back to the front and read the amount again. $5 million, he said. "We've built a lot," Candace said. "The business, the properties. If something happened to you, I need to know I'm protected. That the life we built doesn't disappear." $5 million is a lot of protection, Brett said. "You're the provider," she said. "That's what it's based on." He did not argue. He put the papers down on the table and looked at them for a moment. Somewhere in his chest, the cold thing from the parking lot shifted and contracted, but he did not give it a name. Not yet. Dolores arrived that afternoon, apparently unannounced, though Brett suspected the timing was not accidental. She came in through the back door the way she always did. Candace had given her a key years ago and poured herself a glass of water before sitting at the kitchen island. She looked at the insurance papers still on the table and tilted her head, as if noticing them for the first time. "Has Candace talked to you about the policy?" Dolores asked. "We talked," Brett said. "It's responsible planning," Dolores said. "You have substantial assets. Candace would be vulnerable without proper coverage." She said it the way she said most things, with the certainty of someone reading aloud from a document they authored themselves. Brett looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Candace, who stood at the counter with her back half-turned, refilling her coffee, not quite facing either of them. He signed the papers. He signed them because refusing would have required an explanation he was not yet ready to give, and because he needed more time before that conversation. He signed with the same pen he used to sign contracts, pressing down firmly, making the letters clear. Candace took the signed pages back with both hands and walked to the counter to put them in her folder. Brett watched her. He watched the way she handled the papers. Carefully, the way you handle something important. Not with the casual relief of a wife who had just secured her financial future. With the focused precision of someone completing a task. That night, alone in his truck in the driveway, while Candace and Dolores watched television inside, Brett sat with the engine off and stared at the garage door. The light was on in the living room behind him, its yellow warmth reaching into the driveway, and he could hear the low murmur of their conversation through the glass. Comfortable and private, the sound of two people who were alone together in a way that did not include him. He assembled what he had. The hotel parking lot, the Nashville trips, the changed phone habits, the insurance policy worth $5 million. Dolores arriving on the same afternoon, the papers were on the table. The fact that no one had asked Brett a single question about what he wanted. No one had sat across from him and said, "Does this feel like something you want to do?" They had simply presented it as the obvious next step, signed and delivered. The picture was not complete yet, but the outline was clear enough to be disturbing. Brett was a man who had learned to trust the outline when the details were still assembling themselves. He had seen enough failing structures to know that you did not wait for the roof to fall before you acknowledged that the walls were wrong. He sat in the truck until the television light went dark. Then he went inside, locked the door, and began to think very carefully about what to do next. 3 months after the signing of the insurance policy, Candace announced she wanted to host a family dinner. She mentioned it on a Tuesday, the way you mentioned something you have been thinking about for a long time, but wanted to frame as a casual idea. She said she had been feeling disconnected lately, from family, from home, from the ease of the early years. She thought a nice dinner might reset things. Just the three of them, her, Brett, and Dolores. Brett said fine. He spent the following 2 weeks watching. Not obviously. He did not change his routine or tip his hand in any direction. He went to work, came home, talked with Candace about the normal small things, a client's renovation timeline, whether the gutters needed cleaning, what to do about the leak in the upstairs bathroom. He was present and even-keeled, the same way he always was, because Brett Halstead had learned early in his life that the most powerful thing you could do in a deteriorating situation was to not let it show on your face. 3 weeks before the dinner, he installed a small security camera in the dining room. He mounted it above the cabinet in the corner of the room, angled toward the table, partially obscured behind a row of Candace's decorative pottery. The reason he told himself, and the reason he would repeat to detectives weeks later, which turned out to be completely true, was that tools had been disappearing from his garage. A cordless drill, a set of impact bits, 3 levels. He had suspected someone was entering through the side yard and helping themselves. The camera was positioned to catch anyone coming through the back of the house. He set it to record continuously and did not think about it again. The evening of the dinner arrived on a Thursday in late October. The light through the trees had gone golden thin, the way it did in the weeks before the clocks changed. Brett came home at 5:30, changed out his work clothes, and started the grill. Candace had spent most of the day in the kitchen. He could smell the garlic and roasting meat from the driveway. She was in good spirits, moving with a kind of charged energy that he recognized but could not immediately place. She had set the table formally, the good plates, the folded cloth napkins. Candles in the center. "What's the occasion?" he asked, looking at the table. "Just dinner," she said, smiling over her shoulder. "Can't we have a nice dinner?" Dolores arrived at 6:15, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing a gray blazer over dark pants. She kissed Candace on the cheek at the door and nodded at Brett. He nodded back. They had established years ago that the minimum courtesy between them was a functional pretense of goodwill, and they both maintained it with the discipline of two people who understood it was easier than the alternative. They sat down to eat. The food was good. Candace had made pot roast, slow-cooked with carrots and potatoes, the kind of meal that filled a house with warmth. There was bread, a salad, the wine Dolores had brought. It was, on its surface, exactly the kind of dinner it was supposed to appear to be. 3 people at a well-set table, eating carefully prepared food, making civil conversation. Brett ate and listened. He watched without appearing to watch. He had developed this habit over years of sitting across negotiating tables from people who were trying to get more than they were offering, contractors who quoted low and built slow, developers who changed specs after the contract was signed. The skill was in looking engaged while your actual attention was distributed across the whole room, across every person, every small inconsistency, every gesture that did not quite match the words. The conversation moved along its usual grooves. Dolores talked about a neighbor's property dispute. Candace described a friend's recent trip to Charleston. Brett asked about the trip, asked follow-up questions, kept the rhythm of the table moving. He was drinking whiskey, a small glass, the same brand he kept in the cabinet by the kitchen window. He noticed that Candace kept glancing at his glass. Not obviously, not in a way a casual observer would catch. But he was not a casual observer. Dolores was also watching. She was contributing to the conversation, laughing in the right places, but her eyes moved toward Brett's glass with a frequency that had nothing to do with the story she was telling. Between the two of them, they had the energy of people managing a performance. Brett ate his food and said nothing. Midway through the meal, Brett stood up. "Out of napkins," he said, gesturing toward the kitchen. He walked through the doorway, stepped to the napkin drawer beside the refrigerator, and pulled it open. He reached in for the napkins. And then, without meaning to, he glanced back through the kitchen pass-through toward the dining room. He saw Candace reach into the pocket of her cardigan. He watched her pull out a small folded paper packet. White, the kind pharmacists use for loose pills, or the kind you fold yourself from a sheet of paper when you want to carry something without a label. She unfolded it with one hand, the other hand flat on the table, and tilted the contents quietly into his whiskey glass. It took 2 seconds, maybe 3. Then she folded the packet and slipped it back in her pocket and smoothed her cardigan. Dolores sat across from her. She had watched the whole thing. She did not look away or pretend to be doing something else. She sat with her hands in her lap and watched with an expression that was calm and satisfied. The same expression Brett had seen on her face when she said things like, "You still think small." The expression of someone who believed everything was going according to plan. Brett stood in the kitchen doorway with the napkins in his hand. 3 seconds passed. The cold thing in his chest was back. It was always the same. Not rage, not panic. Just the cold, clean clarity that came when the full picture finally assembled itself, and you understood exactly what you were looking at. He walked back to the table. He set the napkins down beside his plate. He looked at his whiskey glass and then at Candace's wine glass. He reached out and picked up both of them, one in each hand. "Let's switch," he said. His voice was easy, unhurried. Candace looked up. "What?" "Your drink looks stronger." He set the wine glass in front of himself and moved the whiskey in front of her. "I want something lighter tonight." A beat of silence. Candace's eyes moved to the whiskey glass. They stayed there for just a fraction of a second too long. Brett watched her face and saw the thing she was trying not to show, the quick internal calculation, the small flinch of a plan encountering an obstacle. Dolores had gone very still on the far side of the table. Candace looked up at him. She searched his face for something, suspicion, anger, knowledge, and she found nothing. Brett gave her nothing. He sat back down and picked up his fork and resumed eating, as if switching glasses was entirely unremarkable, something he did every week. "It's fine," Candace said after a moment. She reached out and picked up the whiskey glass. She drank. Brett cut a piece of meat and put it in his mouth. The table resumed its rhythm. Dolores said something about the wine. Candace answered. Outside, The wind came off the lake and moved through the trees, and the candles on the table shifted in the draft from the window. Brett ate his dinner and said nothing. 20 minutes after the glass swap, the dinner was winding down. Candace had gotten up to start clearing plates. Brett was finishing the last of his new drink, the wine, and Dolores was talking about a documentary she had seen recently, something about real estate markets in the South. It was the most ordinary scene imaginable. The candles had burned lower. The kitchen light was warm through the doorway. Outside, the first crickets of the evening had started up near the tree line. Then Candace set a plate on the kitchen counter and said nothing for a moment. Brett heard her go quiet. He turned in his chair. She was standing at the counter with one hand pressed flat against the surface and the other holding the edge of the upper cabinet. Her back was to him, but he could see the rigidity in her shoulders, the way her spine had gone stiff. "Something's wrong," she said. Her voice came out tight and small. She turned around. Her face had gone pale in a way that makeup could not cover, a grayish pallor that started at her lips and spread outward. Sweat showed at her hairline. Her right hand was shaking when she lifted it from the counter. She looked at Brett and then at Dolores, and the calculation in her eyes was gone, replaced by something closer to animal fear. Dolores stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor. She came around the table and took Candace's arm. "What did you?" Dolores stopped. She looked at the table. She looked at the whiskey glass, still sitting in front of Brett's spot, empty. Then she looked at the wine glass in front of where Candace had been sitting. The math of what had happened took about 2 seconds to reach her face. The color drained out of it. Brett was already on the phone. He dialed 911 with the same unhurried certainty he used when calling a supplier to report a missing order. He told the dispatcher his wife was showing signs of a medical emergency, sweating, shaking, possible poisoning. He gave the address. He was calm, clear, and specific. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. Brett stayed out of their way. He answered their questions in full. He told them what she had eaten, what she had drunk, how much. He mentioned that she might have ingested something she should not have. He said it simply, as a fact, without emphasis or drama. The paramedics moved quickly. They loaded Candace onto the stretcher and had her in the ambulance within 5 minutes. Dolores stood by the door with her arms crossed. She was watching Brett. He could feel her trying to read him, trying to find the crack in his composure, the guilty thing she expected to see now that the plan had come apart. She found nothing. Brett stood near the kitchen counter with his hands in his pockets, watching the ambulance back out of the driveway. "She's going to be fine," he said, to no one in particular. Dolores said nothing. At the hospital, doctors confirmed what the paramedics suspected. The toxicology panel came back within 2 hours. There was a compound in Candace's system that was not supposed to be there, a substance identified by the on-call physician as consistent with certain veterinary sedatives that in sufficient doses could slow cardiac function and cause multi-organ stress. The dosage she had received was serious. The fact that she had received the amount she did, rather than a larger amount, was the only reason her prognosis was stable. A hospital liaison came to find Brett in the waiting room and informed him that given the toxicology results, protocol required them to notify law enforcement. Brett nodded. He said he understood. He said he would cooperate fully. 2 detectives from the county sheriff's office arrived at the hospital within the hour. They were professional and measured. They introduced themselves and asked Brett to walk them through the evening. He did. He described the dinner, the menu, who was present, what everyone drank. He was precise about the timeline. Before he finished, Dolores appeared in the hallway behind the detectives. She had clearly been waiting. "He tried to poison her," Dolores said. Her voice was sharp and controlled, the voice of a woman who had been rehearsing this moment. "He's jealous. He found out about a friend of hers, and he couldn't handle it." She met the detective's eyes with complete conviction. "He's been unstable for months." The detectives looked at Brett. Brett looked back at them steadily. "I'd like to show you something," he said. Brett drove back to the house with one detective riding with him and the other following in a patrol car. The neighborhood was dark by then, the porch lights of the neighboring houses small and distant through the trees. He unlocked the front door and led them inside. The dining room was exactly as they had left it. Plates stacked on the counter. Candles burned down to stubs. The good tablecloth slightly pulled at one corner where someone had gripped it in a hurry. Brett walked to the corner cabinet, reached behind a row of decorative pottery on the top shelf, and unclipped the small security camera from its mount. He handed it to the detective on his left. "I installed this about 3 weeks ago," Brett said. "Tools were going missing from the garage. I wanted footage of anyone coming through the back of the house." He paused. "I never checked the footage after tonight's dinner. I'd like to review it with you now." They connected the camera to a laptop the detective pulled from his bag. The footage was clear. The angle was wide enough to cover most of the dining room table, slightly elevated, the kind of view that captured everything from shoulder height up. They scrolled to the timestamp matching dinner service and let it play. The room was silent while it ran. Brett watched the footage with the same detachment he brought to reviewing anything that needed to be evaluated. He saw himself stand up from the table. He saw himself disappear through the kitchen doorway. He watched Candace reach into her cardigan pocket. He watched her unfold the packet, tilt it over his glass, and return it to her pocket in one smooth, practiced motion. He watched Dolores sitting across from her, hands folded, expression settled and satisfied. He watched himself come back to the table. He watched the glass swap. When it finished, the lead detective sat back in his chair. He did not say anything immediately. He looked at his partner. He looked at Brett. The silence in the room lasted long enough to become a different kind of sound entirely. "Mr. Halstead," the detective finally said. He stopped. He tried again. "You saved your own life." Brett nodded once. There was nothing to add to that. He had not known, sitting in that dining room the night before with the cold thing in his chest and the napkins in his hand, whether he would have the footage or not. He had not installed the camera thinking about Candace. He had installed it thinking about a missing cordless drill and a set of bits that had been walking off his garage shelves. But that was the thing about doing things correctly. You did them for the right reasons, with the right attention, and sometimes the result extended further than you planned. You built the foundation solid, and discovered later it could hold more weight than you originally intended. The evidence was cataloged. The camera and its memory card were tagged and entered into the chain of custody. The detectives photographed the dining room, the glasses, the table. A forensic technician was called in to process the surface of the whiskey glass. They found residue consistent with what the toxicology panel had identified in Candace's system. The folded paper packet was recovered from Candace's cardigan pocket, which a hospital nurse had set aside in a plastic bag with her other personal effects. The packet still had trace residue along its creased interior. Detectives went back to Dolores with new questions. The tone of those conversations changed. By the next morning, both Candace and Dolores had been informed they were persons of interest in a criminal investigation. Candace, from her hospital bed, wept. She was convincing at it in the way she was convincing at most performances, the eyes wet at exactly the right moment, the voice breaking at the right pitch. "My husband tried to kill me," she told the night nurse. She repeated it to the detective who came to take her statement at 7 in the morning. She described Brett as controlling, suspicious, unstable. She said she had been afraid of him for years. The detective listened carefully. Then he showed her a still image captured from the dining room footage. It was a high-resolution frame of Candace's hand over Brett's whiskey glass, the paper packet tilted, the white powder caught mid-fall. She did not speak for a long time after that. Trenton Vale had been unreachable for 2 days after the dinner. His phone went to voicemail. He was not at his apartment in Nashville when detectives went to knock. His co-worker at the dealership told him Trenton had called in sick and sounded strange. His car, one of the demonstrator vehicles from the lot, a black sedan he drove like it belonged to him, was tracked by its GPS to a hotel outside of Murfreesboro, 80 miles south. Detectives found him in the hotel restaurant at 9 in the morning, working through his second cup of coffee with the focused intensity of a man who had not slept. He was still wearing the same clothes from 2 days ago. When they introduced themselves, he looked at them with an expression that Brett, had he been there, would have recognized immediately. The expression of someone who has realized the game they thought they were winning has already been decided against them. He denied everything in the first hour. He had a story ready. He and Candace were friends, nothing more, and he had no knowledge of any dinner or any plan. He was smooth about it. He had spent 15 years selling people things by making them feel that the decision was theirs, that the value was obvious, that the concern they started with was never really worth worrying about. He ran that same playbook on the detectives. Then they showed him the phone records. The messages between Trenton and Candace ran to over 600 exchanges in the past year alone. Many of them were what you would expect, the usual intimate language of two people in a secret. But several dozen of them were something else. They were logistical. They were specific. They discussed timing, access, a substance sourced through a contact Trenton had in a different state, and a final plan in which Brett Halstead would not survive the dinner. But there was another layer to the messages that Trenton had apparently not spent enough time reading carefully when they were sent. In a thread dated 6 weeks before the dinner, Candace wrote to her mother, on a messaging app they apparently did not realize was captured and the cloud backup detectives had subpoenaed, and outlined what would happen after Brett was gone. The insurance payout, the asset liquidation, the division between herself and Dolores, and Trenton Vale's role in the aftermath, which was not the role Trenton believed he was playing. In Candace's version of the plan, Trenton's usefulness ended the moment the poison was administered. After that, Candace intended to go to police and tell them that Trenton had coerced her into participating, that he was obsessed with her, that he had threatened her, that she had been too frightened to come forward. The life insurance policy would pay out. Trenton would go to prison for a murder he helped commit, framed by the woman he thought he was helping. Candace and Dolores would split $5 million and walk away clean. The detective slid the printed message thread across the table. Trenton read it. He read it twice. Then he sat back in his chair and exhaled slowly through his nose, the way a person does when something they should have expected still manages to land hard. She was going to frame me, he said. That's what the evidence suggests, the detective said. Trenton was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at his coffee cup. He looked at the detective with the tired, deflated expression of a man who had gambled on the wrong hand and knew it. Then he asked for a lawyer. And after 40 minutes with the lawyer, he talked. He gave him everything. The sourcing of the compound. The timeline of communication with Candace. The discussions about dosage and method. He confirmed that Dolores was aware of the plan from the beginning and had contributed strategically to parts of it, including her insistence on the insurance policy and the specific amount. He was cooperative and complete, in the way that people become cooperative and complete when they understand that the only deal available to them requires being useful before the window closes. The motive, confirmed through Trenton's testimony and the chain of messages, was straightforward: money. Not passion, not rage, not the complicated product of a broken relationship finally hitting its limit. Just money. $5 million in life insurance, 3 properties, a profitable business, and a plan to collect all of it by removing the one person who had built it. Brett filed for divorce the morning after the detectives finished their preliminary interviews. He did not wait. He drove to his attorney's office before 8 o'clock, sat down across the desk, and laid out the situation in the same measured, factual way he laid out construction timelines. His attorney, a man named Gerald Pruitt who had handled Brett's business contract for 6 years, listened without interrupting. When Brett finished, Pruitt looked at him for a moment. "You're sure you want to move on this immediately?" Pruitt asked. "I'm sure," Brett said. "Candace is still in the hospital." "I know where she is," Brett said. "I want the filings done today." Pruitt nodded and reached for his pen. The divorce proceedings ran parallel to the criminal case, which meant that the evidence being assembled for the prosecution also served as a remarkably thorough record of financial conduct during the marriage. Bank statements showed that over the prior 2 years, Candace had redirected significant amounts from the joint household accounts into a personal account Brett had not known existed. The total was just over $43,000, moved in careful increments. Nothing large enough to trigger a flag, everything small enough to look like ordinary spending. Candace's attorneys initially tried to argue that the assets were jointly held and that any division should follow standard Tennessee marital property guidelines. This was a reasonable legal position until the criminal charges were formalized, at which point the picture changed substantially. Attempted murder and conspiracy were not positions that generated judicial sympathy in asset division hearings. Still, Candace tried. She appeared at the first hearing looking composed, dressed simply, with her attorney beside her and a story ready. She told the family court judge that she had been manipulated by her mother, by Trenton, by a situation she did not fully understand until it was too late. She said she had been in a vulnerable emotional state. She said Brett had been distant and cold, and that she had made poor decisions looking for support in the wrong places. The judge was listening. Pruitt let her finish. Then he placed on the record the text message thread that prosecutors had shared with the defense in discovery, the one where Candace wrote, in her own words, to her mother, "Once Brett is gone, we split everything. Mom says accidents happen every day." It was one sentence. It did not require interpretation. The judge granted full asset protection in Brett's favor. The joint accounts were frozen and subsequently released to Brett. The property holdings were confirmed as Brett's sole interest. The personal account Candace had been building was flagged for recovery. She received nothing that Brett had built. The home they had shared was his. The business was his. The lake properties were his. Candace sat at the defense table during the ruling with her hands in her lap and her jaw set. She had the look of someone who had bet everything on a single outcome and was now watching the dealer turn over the wrong card. Her attorney requested a conference. The judge declined to delay the ruling. Brett left the courthouse through the side door, the same one he had used to arrive. The sky was clear and cold, the kind of November morning where the light comes in flat and bright. He drove back to Cedar Hollow, went to the office, reviewed the week's project schedules, and ate lunch at his desk. Normalcy was not performance. It was discipline. He had built his life carefully, and now that it was confirmed as still his, he intended to return to it without ceremony. Cedar Hollow had never seen anything like it. The town was small enough that everyone knew someone connected to the case, and large enough that the story had reached the Knoxville News within 48 hours of Candace's hospitalization. By the time the trial date arrived, the case had been covered by 2 regional papers, a Nashville outlet, and a crime podcast that ran a 3-part episode series on it. People who had attended the same church as Candace, who had sat beside her at the country club, who had accepted her dinner invitations and admired her house and believed every gracious word she had ever said to them, now sat in parking lots and argued about what they had missed and how they had missed it. Brett did not follow the coverage. He did not read the articles or listen to the podcast. He knew what had happened because he had lived it. He did not require outside narration. The trial itself began on a gray Tuesday in February. The courthouse in the county seat was a modest building with a wide front staircase and the particular stale warmth of rooms that were always full of people with somewhere they would rather be. Brett sat at the prosecution's side table when called as a witness and answered every question with the same precision he brought to the depositions. Specific, honest, unembellished. The evidence was overwhelming, and the prosecution knew how to use it. The camera footage was the centerpiece. The jury watched it in the hushed courtroom, and Brett watched the jury watch it. He saw the moment the image registered. Candace's hand over the glass, the powder falling, Dolores sitting still and satisfied across the table. Some of the jurors looked away. One woman in the second row pressed her lips together and did not look back at the screen. The text messages were entered into the record, printed and distributed to each juror in packets. The prosecution read the key lines aloud. "Once Brett is gone, we split everything. Mom says accidents happen every day." The defense objected to the reading. The objection was overruled. Trenton's testimony came on the 3rd day of the trial. He had accepted a plea arrangement, reduced charges in exchange for full cooperation, and he took the stand with the composed resignation of a man who understood his best available future required him to be honest in the present. He described the sourcing of the compound. He described the conversations about timing. He described Candace's specific instruction about which glass to make sure Brett drank from. He described the secondary plan, the plan to leave him holding the murder charge once Brett was dead. The defense cross-examined him aggressively. His deal, his credibility, his motives. Trenton absorbed it. His story did not change because the truth did not require him to remember which version he had told. He answered consistently across 3 hours of cross-examination, and the jury could see the difference between a man recounting a fabrication and a man recounting something that had actually happened. Dolores took the stand on her own behalf. It was a mistake. Her attorney had likely advised against it. But Dolores was a woman who had spent her life believing she was the smartest person in any room, and she was not prepared to sit silently while other people decided her fate. She testified with precision and calm, the way she did everything. She attempted to reframe the narrative. Brett had been financially controlling, had isolated Candace, had created the conditions that led Candace to make desperate decisions. She positioned herself as a protective mother responding to a daughter in crisis. The prosecutor asked her, with the camera footage already admitted into evidence, to explain the expression on her face in the footage as Candace poured the powder. Dolores said the footage was unclear. The prosecutor asked the courtroom's audiovisual technician to pull the specific frame. The image appeared on the screen at the front of the courtroom. Dolores's face in the moment after the powder was poured, looking toward her daughter with an expression that was calm, deliberate, and satisfied. Dolores said she had not been paying attention. "You were looking directly at your daughter," the prosecutor said. "At the glass." "At that exact moment." "I don't recall," Dolores said. The jury heard the exchange. They had already seen the frame. There was nothing left to argue about. The defense tried to introduce character witnesses for both Candace and Dolores. Neighbors, the country club social director, a woman from the church auxiliary who described Candace as warm and generous. Brett watched them take the stand and say true things about a person who had also, in the same life, written, "Once Brett is gone, we split everything." People were complicated. Evidence was not. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Brett had been told by Pruitt to expect at least a full day, possibly 2. He drove back to the office after the jury was sent in and reviewed blueprints for a new project, a cabin build for a client on the western arm of the lake. He made 3 phone calls. He ate a sandwich at his desk. He was not waiting for the verdict in the sense that he needed it to feel resolved. The truth of what had happened was already established. The verdict would simply attach consequences to it. Pruitt called at 4:15. "They're back," he said. Brett drove to the courthouse. He found a seat in the gallery and watched the proceedings. Candace was brought in from the holding area, her attorney beside her. Dolores entered from the other side. They did not look at each other. They did not look at Brett. The jury filed in. The 4-person stood. Brett watched each juror as they settled into their seats. They did not look at Candace or Dolores. That told him something. People who had just acquitted a defendant usually looked at them on the way in. These 12 people looked at the judge. For Candace Halstead, guilty on the count of attempted murder. Guilty on the count of criminal conspiracy. For Dolores Wexler, guilty on the count of conspiracy. Guilty on the count of attempted murder. There was no outburst in the gallery. There was instead the particular silence of a room full of people who had quietly expected this outcome and were processing the confirmation. The defense attorneys conferred in low voices. The prosecutor made a note. In the gallery, someone shifted in their seat, and the sound was very loud in the quiet. Brett felt nothing he had not already felt. The verdict was correct. It matched the evidence. It matched the footage and the messages and the testimony and the forensic report and every detail he had watched accumulate over the course of the investigation. There was no relief because he had not been afraid. Not of the outcome, not of being disbelieved. He had the camera. He had signed nothing he had not agreed to sign. He had done nothing he had not been willing to explain. The truth had been available from the first night, waiting on a memory card mounted behind a row of pottery, and the truth was the only thing he had ever needed. The sentencing phase followed 2 weeks later. The judge reviewed the severity of the offense, the premeditated nature of the plan, the financial motive, and the systematic deception involved in the execution. Candace received 12 years. Dolores received 9. When the deputies moved to escort Candace from the courtroom, she turned. Brett was 3 rows behind the prosecution table, watching. She found his eyes across the room, and for a moment something passed over her face. The last performance, the final version of the expression she had spent years perfecting. Wronged, betrayed, victimized. You ruined my life, she said. Her voice cracked on the last word, exactly as it was meant to. The courtroom went still. Deputies paused. Everyone waited. Brett looked at her. He did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He did not feel any of the things she wanted him to feel in that moment. Not guilt, not regret, not the complicated sorrow of a man reviewing what his marriage had cost him. No, he said. Quiet. Even. You try to end mine. That was all. The deputies let her out. Dolores followed without speaking. The doors closed behind them. The courtroom began to empty. Brett remained seated for a moment longer, watching the room clear. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out into the winter afternoon. A year passed the way years pass when you're focused on the work in front of you rather than the story behind you. Halstead Construction picked up 3 new contracts in the spring, 2 lake cabin builds, and a significant renovation on a historic property near downtown Knoxville that tested Brett's crew in ways that straightforward new construction never did. He liked the difficult projects. They required patience and careful attention to the existing structure. They required understanding what had been built badly before you could correct it. He hired a new office manager named Pat, a retired schoolteacher's wife who had spent 15 years running her family's hardware store and knew how to handle vendors, billing, and the particular kind of chaos that construction schedules generated without breaking a sweat. She brought order to the administrative side of the business that Brett had never quite managed to maintain on his own. Within 6 months, the paperwork was cleaner than it had ever been. He gave the lake house a quiet renovation, not a dramatic overhaul. He was not that kind of person. He replaced the kitchen countertops, had the porch refinished, updated the dock pilings that had been softening for 2 seasons. He did much of the smaller work himself on evenings and weekends, the way he had in the early years when the business was young and every project was something he built with his own hands. There was a satisfaction in it that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the feeling of a tool used correctly and a joint that held. He heard occasional updates about Candace and Dolores through Pruitt, whose office continued to handle residual legal matters from the divorce. Both were appealing their sentences. The appeals were unlikely to succeed, Pruitt said, given the nature of the evidence. Brett nodded and moved on to the next item on the agenda. Trenton Vale had relocated to a city in the Midwest following his plea agreement, presumably trying to start over with a reduced charge on his record and the particular burden of knowing that the woman he helped plan a murder had also planned to hand him the full weight of it afterward. Brett did not spend time thinking about Trenton. He was a secondary character in a story that was now over. On a Saturday morning in late October, Brett took his coffee down to the dock. The sky above Fort Loudon Lake was the pale blue that early autumn mornings had before the day warmed up and deepened it. The water was still. The opposite bank showed the full color change. The maples had gone orange, the oaks deep red, the occasional yellow poplar bright as a lit match against the gray of the far ridge. A heron stood in the shallows about 50 yards north, completely motionless, watching the water with the patient focus of a creature that understood that good outcomes required stillness and time. Brett's friend Dale had come over to help with the dock repairs the previous day and had stayed for dinner. Now Dale sat in one of the dock chairs with his own coffee, watching the water and saying nothing in the comfortable way of people who have known each other long enough to not need to fill the silence. After a while, Dale said, You doing all right? For real. I am, Brett said. No part of you is, Dale paused. I don't know. Haunted by it? Everything that happened. Brett looked out across the water. He thought about the question honestly, the way he thought about all things, without shortcuts, without the easy answer that made the conversation shorter. I'm not haunted, he said finally. I'm clear. Dale looked at him. Clear. I spent years building something and they tried to take it. They didn't. Everything I built is still here. He turned a coffee cup in his hands. That's not haunting. That's just what happened. Dale nodded slowly. After another stretch of quiet, he said, You never saw it coming? With Candace. Brett thought about Candace standing in the doorway the day they first met, wearing the yellow dress. He thought about the Thanksgiving when Dolores said, You still think small, and Candace reached for her wine without a word. He thought about the afternoon in the hotel parking lot, the Nashville trips, the insurance policy with a large number on the first page. I saw it coming, he said. I just didn't know where it was going. He looked at the heron in the shallows, still motionless, still watching. People like that, Brett said, they always believe that wanting something badly enough is the same as deserving it. They think if the plan is clever enough, the outcome is guaranteed. He paused. But greed makes people careless. They start cutting corners because they're already spending the money in their heads. They stop checking the details. They forget that the person they're moving against might be paying closer attention than they're giving him credit for. The camera, Dale said. The camera, Brett said. He almost smiled. For missing power tools. Dale laughed quietly. That's something. Brett raised his coffee cup toward the water, toward the lake, toward the far ridge with its burning trees, toward the dock he had rebuilt and the house he had kept, and the business that was more solid than it had ever been. The morning was still enough that the surface of the lake held a clean reflection of the sky above it. Pale blue, slightly pink at the edges where the sun had not fully committed yet. A fishing boat sat motionless about a quarter-mile out, and the sound of it, which was nothing, felt complete. Brett had sat on this dock in all seasons and in most moods, and he had learned that the lake did not change based on what you brought to it. It was there before you arrived, and it would be there after. There was something steadying in that. He thought about the years he had spent building. Not just the business, not just the houses and the properties, but the daily, unglamorous labor of keeping something whole. The early mornings when the truck would not start. The winter when a burst pipe flooded a client's basement the day before their move-in. The supplier who disappeared with a deposit, and the 2 months it took Brett to recover the loss without cutting his crew's pay. None of that was visible in what he owned now. The lake house looked like ease and arrival. It did not look like the 15 years of specific, grinding effort that had made it possible. Most things that were worth having looked that way, clean on the outside, the work invisible inside the walls. That was what people like Candace and Dolores had never understood about him. They had looked at what he owned and made a calculation, the same way you might appraise a building from the street. They valued the result without understanding the structure. They assumed that what they could take away was the whole of what he was. They did not understand that a man who builds things from scratch does not stop knowing how to build just because someone removes the building. Even if their plan had worked, even if the powder had found the right glass and the right outcome, they would have discovered eventually that $5 million and a dead man's properties were not the same thing as what Brett had. The business would have stalled without him. The reputation would have faded. The money would have been spent the way money always was when it arrived without discipline behind it. They would have had the furniture without the foundation. But it had not worked, and he was still here. The heron lifted off from the shallows without warning, its wide wings spreading slowly, carrying it out over the water in a long, low arc before it disappeared behind the far tree-line. Brett watched it go. He had built this life from the ground up, with care and with patience, from the days when he had nothing but a borrowed tool and a willingness to work. He had built it against doubt and dismissal and the quiet contempt of people who thought what he had was small. He had built it through the years when someone who was supposed to stand beside him was instead measuring what it was worth. They came for what he built. They came with a plan and a powder and a policy with $5 million on the first page. And they came with performances rehearsed well enough to fool an entire town. But they did not count on the camera in the corner or the cold clarity that lived in the chest of a man who had been paying attention for longer than they knew. They thought greed made them smart. It only made them careless. And Brett Halstead was still here, at the edge of his lake, in a life he had built, with the morning sun moving across the water the same way it had every day for 15 years, unhurried and certain and entirely unchanged.